Hi, my name's Phil. I like to talk about politics. And the US government published its national security strategy. In amongst the babbling, it is openly attacking the nature of liberal European democracy. It talks of wanting to work with certain groups in Europe, which are clearly meant to mean far-right groups such as National Rally, the AfD. Trump promotes racist ideological attacks on Europe and the EU in particular, which are not only factually false but incredibly dangerous. Unsurprisingly, the Kremlin has announced they're loving it. They are heaping praise on the USA for this document. Oh, this is exactly what we've been saying, they've said. America has been promoted to Putin's Poodle of the Year. There was also a concerted effort on Twitter, at least, to push anti-EU messages all yesterday, though I'm sure it's continuing today. There was a point where almost every post in my feed was pushing this specific line of anti-EU propaganda, with Musk himself calling for the EU to be disbanded. Take a look. So just to highlight what I'm talking about here. So I'm recording this on Sunday. This video is going to come out later. I'm recording it on Sunday just to go through. Elon Musk, how long before the EU is gone? Abolish the EU. And next one, Europe is not our allies when you censor free speech. Blah, blah, blah. Another one, anti-Europe. Why are we in NATO? So again, anti-European defence. Like the EU isn't a country, it isn't a state, has a blah, 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 blah. President no one voted for. Yes, they did. It doesn't matter, but it's all anti-EU, anti-Europe stuff, right? You just go down the whole feed. This is, and you may think this is normal, by the way. It's not actually normal for me. On my feed, I mean, we're lucky like there's one from Elon Musk there. I saw one earlier on. You think, well, he amplifies his own posts on his own platform, right? Yes. I don't actually get him coming up that much. But there we go. There's another one there. It's all almost completely anti-EU stuff. Even given that you may think, because if you don't use this platform before, Phil, it's been used to promote right-wing stuff, far-right stuff, and absolutely is, and it amplifies that and it throttles counterpoints. That's exactly what it is. But nonetheless, I do not get this all the time. It's more of a mix for me in my feed. I generally get more of a mix. This is coordinated because almost every single post, and this, remember, is since Donald Trump, the White House, brought out its anti-EU and anti-liberal democracy in Europe document. Almost every single... there's one from Kemi Bad not talking about Motability. That's nice. But so many of these posts, and it has been all day, have been this anti-EU stuff. Of course, if the EU did break up, it would be brilliant for Putin. The EU and its precursors stands as the most successful peace project in human history. The major powers of Europe could never go more than a generation before at least two of them started knocking lumps out of one another, with others often joining in. Then, after the Second World War, those powers decided to use trade to bind themselves together in common purpose, and there hasn't been a war amongst them since. Of course, the immediate threat of the EU breaking up would probably be less intercontinental war and simply being taken apart one by Russia. NATO is effectively defunct as far as I can tell. I'm not a defence expert, of course. But when Russia is launching incursions into NATO territory with obviously malicious intent, and NATO is doing nothing to dissuade them, then what are we to conclude? And with the threat from the USA to withdraw all support for Ukraine again, I mean, what then? Putin is on the edge of ruin thanks to his mishandling of his intended invasion of Ukraine, but he has been let off the hook here. Perhaps some of these MAGA loons see the EU as an economic rival and therefore weakening them strengthens the USA. But this is the sort of blind alley that zero-sum thinking takes you down. If Europe is weakened, Russia will weaken it further, and Europe are amongst America's best customers. Jamie Dimon, CEO of JP Morgan, was given a speech last week in which he talked about what he saw as some of the economic challenges Europe has, but also how vital Europe's success is to America's success. He was saying, if America wants to succeed, it needs to make sure Europe succeeds. Trump and his cabal are not just screwing allies over, for which MAGA might not care, but themselves. Did Europe make a mistake in long-term planning which did not factor in a hostile US government? I mean, let's look at the situation we find ourselves in and how it's developed in less than a year of this second Trump presidency. The core of Trump's argument is that Europe has taken advantage of the United States for years, running a huge trade surplus while not paying its fair share for defence. In 2024, the EU's goods trade surplus with the US was nearly 200 billion euros. For Trump, this isn't a normal feature of global trade. It's a debt to be collected. His strategy isn't just about balancing the books. It's about using America's weapon, its massive consumer market, to pressure Europe into economic concessions. This conflict is being fought on two fronts. First, a direct trade war targeting Europe's industrial heart. Okay. The problem is, of course, it's also doing America economic damage as well. Second, a more subtle but equally serious tech war aimed at asserting American dominance and challenging Europe's digital sovereignty. You know, they form in a pincer movement that could leave the European economy in a very difficult position. The trade war, on the other hand, even though it's technically not a trade war because Europe hasn't retaliated, but still trade friction at the very least, and then allowing these major tech companies to have such dominance. The opening shots have already been fired. The Trump administration's tariffs, which began with a 10% baseline in April and then rose to 20% for the EU, are just the start. While a subsequent deal in the summer of 2025 capped the rate for most EU goods at 15% to avoid further escalation. The framework is fragile. Key sectors are excluded. There's more argy-bargy coming next year on arguing over the details of it still. The logic is to make European products more expensive so Americans buy fewer of them and therefore more American stuff. But of course, all it's actually doing is raising the cost of things for Americans. The primary target is the engine of European economy, Germany's auto sector. Trump has repeatedly complained about the imbalance in the car trade. A significant tariff would be devastating for manufacturers like BMW, Volkswagen, Mercedes, whose profits rely heavily on US sales. Economic models, such as those from the Kiel Institute, have projected that steep auto tariffs would cause European exports to the US to plummet and significantly harm Germany's car production. Oh, and if the German economy takes a nosedive, there's a far-right group gaining momentum thanks to both circumstance and heavy promotion by Space Karen and now Donald Trump. This is the danger for European leaders in general. Trump wants to promote far-right groups in Europe to take power as much as possible. He may think he'll be getting political allies, but what he will get is easy targets for Russia's attacks. If Europe is weakened, so too is the USA. But it wouldn't stop with cars. The tariffs would hit everything from French wine to Italian luxury goods. The EU fails to retaliate, and this is where the asymmetry becomes really obvious. Europe's economy is fundamentally built on exports, which account for about 30% of its GDP, compared to around 11% for the United States. In a dollar-for-dollar tariff fight, Europe has more to lose. A prolonged trade war risks diverting a flood of goods, once destined for the US, straight into the European market, which would further undercut local industries. It's different when dealing with a sane US president. The EU would just apply targeted retaliatory tariffs like it has done in the past, hurt key people close to the administration, calm things down. But Trump is insane. China managed it because they supply a lot of cheap essentials to US customers. Europe, not so much in that line of exports. It's more sort of higher quality stuff. The second front of this economic war is technology. For years, the EU has been trying to build what it calls digital sovereignty, which is an attempt to regulate big tech, protect user data with laws like GDPR, foster its own tech giants. It has worked up until now, and Brussels see this as a matter of democratic control. Easy to see from what I just showed you what happened on Twitter yesterday. Washington, especially under Trump, sees this as a direct attack on America's most powerful companies, Google, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, X. A Trump administration could retaliate against digital regulations with its own tariffs or restrictions on critical technologies. That transforms a regulatory dispute into a battle for technological supremacy. And at the moment, America is ahead of the game on it. There is a long-standing view in Washington that the EU's regulation of US tech firms is discriminatory. They don't really like regulation. Even the sane ones in America don't like regulation. The conflict is between Europe's precautionary principle that tech should be proven safe before deployment and America's move fast and break things ethos. Europe's dependency here is staggering. It relies heavily on the US and China for digital infrastructure. And it's hard to put an exact number on it. The continent is caught between the need for American software and Chinese hardware. For example, depending on the ranking, only a handful of the world's 50 largest tech companies are European. If the US were to use this dependency as leverage, say by restricting access to cloud services or critical software, that's a powerful and fairly terrifying bargaining chip. So to counter this, European leaders have launched initiatives like the EU Chips Act. The frameworks like this designed to build homegrown alternatives in AI, cloud and cybersecurity, but they are years behind. Between 2013 and 2024, private AI investment in the United States was many times higher than the entire EU. I mean, that's a chasm, not just a gap. The EU is set to regulate tech, not necessarily create it at the same scale as the US. But while Europe debates the rules and has already weakened some of them this year because of Trump, the US is building these empires. This tech dependency makes Europe vulnerable to pressure, forcing it to choose between regulatory ambitions and access to the technology that powers its economy. But of course, if it weakens those regulatory ambitions, then it's more likely to be taken over by the far-right allies of Donald Trump. You're caught between a rock and a hard place. So why is Europe in such a tough spot? Why isn't there a more forceful, unified response from the capitals? Well, the first one is this economic model. For countries like Germany, prosperity is built on this formula of export high-quality goods to the US and China while keeping domestic consumption relatively low. This export-heavy model is a huge liability in an era of rising protectionism. With the Chinese market slowing, US tariffs in place, the two main pillars of European growth are shaking. The second reason is internal division. The EU, of course, is a bloc of 27 sovereign nations with their own competing interests. When faced with US pressure, unity is hard to maintain. Some leaders may be tempted to break ranks and cut their own deals, leaving the rest of the EU exposed and weakening any unified response. But the deepest, most unspoken reason for Europe's cautious stance is, as I keep saying, security. Europe has largely relied on the United States for its defence for far too long. A Trump administration actively threatens this arrangement, demanding allies take on more of the burden for their own defence, which I've said before is actually fair. But viewing NATO as a more transactional alliance, in a remark in early 2024, Trump even suggested he would encourage Russia to do whatever the hell they want to NATO members who don't meet Trump's defence spending targets. This threat creates an almost impossible dilemma. European leaders know they need to counter American economic pressure, but they fear that pushing back too hard provokes a US withdrawal from NATO, leaving them to face a hostile Russia alone, which we're not ready to do yet. As some analysts argue, it forces a choice between economic pain and existential threat. They may be choosing to appease Washington on trade in the desperate hope of preserving the American security umbrella, however uncertain it may be. It's been put in a very vulnerable position. Appease Trump on trade, as both the UK and EU have done. You preserve economic growth, giving sensible governments a chance of remaining in power, or that power swaps between different sane options at least. But this also means ceding more power to Trump. It's almost like a slow decline being preferable to a rapid one, because maybe with a slow decline, something changes in America in a few years. But call Trump out in the same way he's calling the EU out, give some back, and you potentially trigger an all-out trade and security war, which risks the sort of economic damage which means populists take power in several European countries, including major players. France and the UK face the very serious threat of far-right takeover. I just hope that European leaders are not doing what they did during Trump's first term, hunkering down, waiting for the term to end and hoping for the best. They need a serious plan that doesn't rely on optimistic outcomes. The problem with that is that European leaders have different perceptions of the threat level from both the United States and Russia. Different domestic concerns as well. Some are the heads of government which don't have long left to run. I mean, we find ourselves in a very dangerous situation. Which is best? Try to keep Trump on side, despite the fact the USA has now published a strategic aim of destroying the EU itself and liberal democracy in Europe and hate speech laws in Europe, or strike back and hope the public back you up in the fight, because this is going to hurt. Let me know in the comments below, and please subscribe to the channel for more content. Click the bell notification icon so you know when new videos are coming out. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.